So, evidence is which piece of the puzzle? Jock? Warrant, exactly. It's the warrant. Evidence is the warrant. And we can get evidence from lots of different places. So there's lots of different places we can get evidence. So we can have analytical warrants. These are logical reasons. So these are things saying that, if it's light outside, it's during the day. Or if it's dark, it's nighttime. I don't need to find some expert out there who says the sun is out during the day. We all kind of know that. These are things we know. If I dump a gallon of paint on the floor, it's gonna leave a mess. I think we all know that. You don't need some special expert to say that. So that's what analytical reasons are. This is just using logic. The second kind is empirical. Empirical. These are statistics and examples from the real world. So remember when we used that 9/10 statistic and we said that 9/10 of Psi Academy scholars have trouble getting to school on time? If we actually did a study, let's say the principal and some of the other teachers here did a study and they talked to all the parents of Psi Academy and they came up with a really good sample and they went and got professors to help them and they figured out that 9/10 of Psi Academy scholars really do have a hard time getting ready for school in the morning. Then that would be evidence that's empirical. It would be research-based. It's an example or a statistic from the real world. If we wanted to say that a certain part of the country tends to vote for one party over the other, those are empirical things. So if we said that New York tends to vote for Democrats more often than Louisiana, that's empirical. We can look at data from lots and lots of elections and we say, yeah, in Louisiana we tend to have more Republicans who get elected, and in California we have more Democrats who get elected, and that's been going on for about 30 years at least. So we could point to those kind of statistics. And the last is psychological. Psychological warrants. So psychological warrants aren't necessarily going to be based on something that someone has already researched. So it isn't going to say, well, we see out in the world that when we get a group of scholars at Psi Academy together, based on the research, 9 out of 10 of them are over 5 feet tall. That might be an empirical research, but psychological is looking more at how people tend to act. So this might be more of from observations that aren't necessarily statistics, that aren't necessarily what we always know, but what we kind of know in our minds based on how people react to situations. So if it's when it gets dark, people turn on lights. So maybe that's why we have daylight savings time last longer, because the longer daylight savings time lasts, the more light there is when people are awake. But that isn't because there's necessarily research. We're saying people tend to not appreciate being punished. So in a school situation, maybe we say, well, if we can provide rewards to scholars who do well, rather than punishing scholars who do poorly, maybe we get better results, because people tend to like being given rewards instead of people finding a punishment to be an incentive to not do something bad. That doesn't mean that either one is better necessarily, but we might say that we think people like being positively reinforced rather than negative reinforcement, and that's psychological warrants. So those are the 3 types of warrants that we're going to typically find in debate. Those are the types that we're going to look for when we're researching, and those are going to be the types of warrants that we're going to want to think about when we're in a debate round. John?
What's warrant?
Warrant? So warrants are the evidence, the different types of evidence that we're using, right?
Yeah.
And so we want to make sure that every type of evidence that we're putting in the round, every type of warrant that we're putting in the round, fits in those categories. And we're almost always going to be able to figure out whether it's an analytical, an empirical, or a psychological warrant based on when we read it. And so usually the most important ones that we're going to be out researching are going to be the empirical and psychological. And then the analytical ones are going to be more the kind we can come up with on our own that we don't necessarily support with a piece of evidence. So let's talk real quickly, and then we will get to the fun part of the day, about the types of evidence we're going to use this year as a debate team. So we have facts, analogies, anecdotes, studies, reports, and stories. Let's just talk about what those 5 things are real quickly. So facts. These are just basic everyday things. There are 28 desks in this room. It's a fact. We can count them, we can know whether that's right or wrong. It's not up for debate. There's some things, there is a floor in this room. We can do it. Right? Those are the sort of things we can just figure out based on the number. 31.
It's actually 30.
Oh, I missed one. Right? But we can do, so facts are just basic things. We know that Jacques has a green name tag in front of him, right? Nobody's going to say, well, no, I don't think, I mean, maybe it's a shade of green, but it's clearly a green name tag, right? So those are facts. We can say there are 4 scholars in this room right now. Nobody's going to, you can't debate that. Right?
Unless you're not counting yourself.
Right, because I don't, right? 'Cause I'm a teacher. I don't get to count this. So if I was talking to Mr. Fabianski at the end of the day and I say there were 4 scholars at debate today, that you can't question that number, right? There were 4. We have 4 signatures on the sign-in sheet. There's 4. So those are just facts. Those are things we already know that we can look up in a encyclopedia. We can look up. Probably Wikipedia even knows it. No matter what, sometimes Wikipedia says weird things, but Wikipedia usually gets facts correct. Second is analogies. So this is trying to relate 2 different things to one another. So maybe it's saying that sitting in school is kind of like sitting in college. So sitting in high school is kind of like sitting in college. There's differences. You're in school a lot more hours in high school. You have dress codes in high school that you probably aren't going to have in college unless you go to one of the military academies or a religious school. There's a lot of differences, but there are a lot of similarities too. You have a teacher, you have textbooks, you have assignments. All these sorts of things happen again. So it's analogous, it's similar. Driving a car is really similar to driving a truck. There's differences, but they're very similar. So if you said that I can look at how a person who lives in New Orleans reacts to hurricanes, it's probably going to be similar to people who live in the coastal Mississippi area. There's not going to be a ton of difference. There's going to be differences, but I can analogize. I can say, well, the people in New Orleans did this at a hurricane, and the people in some other city should have also done these things. And so we can make those kinds of analogies. The next kind is anecdotes. So this is kind of your own personal stories, or things that are little tidbits of information. So it might be, Jacques can say, well, my dad was talking about when his first debate round happened, this is the sort of thing that went on. And those are little anecdotes. They aren't necessarily true across everyone, but they say, see, here's a specific situation in which this is true. So we might look to things like the Super Bowl. We say, well, when the Saints won the Super Bowl, the city of New Orleans was absolutely ecstatic. Everyone here was going crazy. People didn't go to school. They had a big parade. So I assume when some other city wins the Super Bowl in the future, probably a really long time in the future because the Saints will win a lot, right? Although not with the way they're playing right now. But right, we can analogize, or we can use an anecdote and say, so that's probably how they react to Super Bowls in other countries, or in other parts of the country, in other parts of the United States. So when New England Patriots won their Super Bowls, they probably had big parades and parties and all of that. Whether I saw that on TV before or not, I don't need to, because I know how it happened here, and I can say, we were all outside, we went to the parade, I bet people in New England went to the parades there too. The fourth is called studies, and this we've already talked about. This would be if we did a big study and we tried to figure out how do the scholars at Sci Academy prepare for school in the morning. And that would be based on what other people have observed, and they're writing it down. And it's usually going to be published. Studies are not going to be something that we're just going to know in our heads. They're going to be something we're going to find in an actual document that we can then cite back to people. Reports are similar, but reports aren't always going to be based on specific things that are observed. They may be looking more to kind of broad ideas. And so you may have a report, someone may say, well, I think that the best way to come up with a uniform policy at a school is to have the scholars be a part of the process. That's not necessarily based on research. It's based on that person's life experiences and observations, but it's not based on hard data. So that's kind of the difference between a study and a report. And the last thing is just stories. And sometimes stories can be fictional, sometimes stories are factual. But a lot of times stories will help us think about a real world problem. So when we're talking about uniforms, or when we start talking next week about the actual resolution, the United States drug policy, whether it should be healthcare or whether it should be treated as criminal, we're going to have stories. We can look to a newspaper article that talks about a real life person who maybe got thrown in jail because of drug possession, but that person was an addict and didn't receive good treatment inside the jail, and it ended up hurting that person. That's a one-person story. It doesn't mean it happens that way everywhere, but it can help us think about these situations, and it provides good context to what we're talking about. So those are kind of the ways we can think about what an argument is. We want to make sure there's all three pieces. Every time we have an argument, we want to make sure that we have the claim, and the warrant, and the impact. Because the impact's going to tell us how important this situation is. Why should we even care about it? The warrant is all these types of evidence that give me reasons to believe it, and then the claim is the most important thing at the very beginning, just to say, here's what I actually think. Because if you don't have any of those three pieces, you're going to be lost. Your audience isn't going to know what you're talking about. You're not going to be able to have a good debate back and forth with the other side. So those are kind of the key things we're going to talk about.